Hello, I am Magistrate Shae and this is another episode of the new Jenki Workshop. Today we are leaving behind the woodshop and coming into the kitchen to learn some of the ins and outs of fabric dyeing. Fabric dyeing can be used for a lot of different things around camp. You can dye up some old bed sheets or tablecloths to build some fabric wall panels. You can color old garb pieces to give them new life or to bring something more in line with your personal color palette. Or if something got stained, you can just dye over it and pretend that never happened. There's a lot of different ways to dye fabric. If you're more of a traditionalist or a purist, you might choose to go the route of natural dyes. This can come from a number of different plant sources, such as berries, vegetables, or tea and coffee. Whatever color you want, there is most likely a plant out there that can give you the color. Just takes a little bit of research online, and there's plenty of resources to get you going on that. It's important to note that the natural dyes will only work on natural fibers, so cotton, linen, silk, wool, along those lines. Synthetic fibers require a special chemical dye, which we will cover in a later part of the video. If you use natural dyes, you also want to be careful with how you wash it, as a lot of the modern detergents are designed to pull stains out of fabric. And essentially, these natural dyes are a stain. So careful how you wash it. Usually hand washing, cold water, spot cleaning is the best way to go. You don't want to undo all of your hard work after all. If you want a bold, vibrant color, you can use a modern chemical dye, such as RIT dye. These are designed to get those ultra-saturated colors that you see on most modern garments. Chemical dyes also usually have a version that can be used for synthetic fibers. It's important to take a look at the packaging to make sure that that's what you're buying if that's what you're after. Dyes made for natural fibers just won't hold on to synthetic fabrics. These dyes are also a lot easier to change up the color saturation because they naturally come far more concentrated. Whichever route you go, you will need to use a compound called a mordant. In simple terms, this is just an additive to the process that will help set the dye. If you want to get really complex about it, there's a bunch of different specialized mordants that you can pick up. But for most cases, just some simple table salt or white vinegar will do you just fine. Again, take a look at whatever dye recipe you're following and use their instructions. Retail dyes will also tell you what to use for a mordant. In part 1 of this video, we're going to go over tea dyeing. In part 2, we'll go over some chemical dyes to dye up some white tablecloths. When starting the tea dyeing process, the first thing you need to do is make sure you have the right fabric. I have picked up a white cotton shirt from Goodwill for less than $5. This one is actually 95% cotton, so there's a little bit of synthetic in there, but because the vast majority is cotton, it should still take the dye just fine. Once you have your fabric, there's a few more things that you need. You want your dye material. In this case, we're using black tea. I got this box from the dollar store. It's mostly black tea, so I might need to use a little bit more of the tea to get the color that I want. Again, dollar store for 100 bags. Can't beat that. Next, you need a pot that is going to be big enough to hold your water and your garment. A lot of resources recommend at least a quart, that's 4 cups, per yard of fabric. I might go a little bit more just to make sure that I have full coverage. It's important that your garment is able to be fully covered with a little bit of room to boil. Next, we're going to be using just plain white table salt and distilled white vinegar. Now to start with, you want your garment to be damp. This helps the dye material get into it easier when you first put it into the dye bath. This goes for if you're using natural dyes or chemical dyes. You also want to wash your fabric first, and if you do that right before you start the dyeing process, you can just pull it straight out of the wash, still damp. Fabric gets set aside. You want to make sure that it stays damp before it goes in. If it starts to dry out while your tea is steeping, you can always just run it under the sink, wring it out, make sure that it's not saturated, but still good and damp. So starting with my nice big pot that you probably can't see, it's a black pot against a black range. I'm going to start with 4 cups of water. And I can always add more water later if it looks like I need more. Next, you want to add 2 tablespoons of salt per quart of water. So I have this on high, heating up right now. Now we're going to bring our water up to a boil. While it's heating, let's get our tea in there. Depending on which recipe you look at, you will get any number of how much tea per water ratio. At minimum, you're going to want 1 tea bag per cup of water, but more tea will give you a better color. Also, you want to use black tea, and since this is not entirely black tea, I'm going to add extra tea anyway. So these bags have a little string and a tag on them, so for simplicity's sake, you just pull that tag out. So again, we have 4 cups, so I'm going to start with 8 tea bags, and after it's steeped for a little bit, we'll see how it looks. Okay, I've got my tea in, the water is heating, and we're going to let it steep for at least 15 minutes, but again, the longer it steeps, the better the color is going to be. Let's come back in a few minutes. We've been simmering for about 20 minutes now, so let's take a look at what we have. You can see a nice, beautiful dark color there. That's just what we want, because our fabric will dry lighter than what it comes out looking wet. And the process of rinsing will also lose some of the color. So I'm going to turn my heat down to low to keep it simmering. Take our fabric and plop it in. Use my poker to get it good and saturated. So I don't know if I lost a bunch of water from boiling off or I just needed more water to begin with, but I have not nearly enough. So I'm going to add another quart, see how that looks. Again, you want to make sure that your fabric is completely covered by your water so that you can get a nice even dye job. Move it around. We're already starting to pick up some color. Okay, so ignore that initial advice that said 1/4 water per yard of fabric. That was clearly wrong, because I am now up to 3 quarts. That's 12 cups of water, and I am fairly satisfied with how well it's submerged. But because I have just added a bunch more water, I need to add a bunch more tea. Alright, I have just added another 16 packets to maintain the 2 tea packets per cup of water ratio that I started with. I turned up my heat just a little bit to bring this back up to a simmer. And next we're just going to let this go for a little while. We'll check in an hour and see how it looks there. The longer you leave it steeping, the darker the color will be. Again, you're going to lose some color when you rinse it, and once it's finally dried, it's going to come out a little bit lighter even. It's just the nature of the dye. So shift your fabric around. Make sure nothing is bunched up too tightly. You want to keep it fully submerged. So if your fabric is doing what mine is, where some of it keeps wanting to float up to the top, you just reach into your utensil drawer and find some heavy things to weigh it down. We're going to let this sit for about an hour. Keep checking it regularly, every 10 minutes or so, just to make sure that you're not losing water and that your fabric isn't burning. Alright, it's been an hour. Let's see what we have. Now remember, if you left your stove on to really low to let it simmer with heat, don't put your hand in it directly. Use a tool. I've got a clawed spoon. You can use a pair of tongs. Use something so that you're not sticking your hands directly into hot liquid. Please be safe. I'm going to pull out my weights. I just used some little glass measuring bowls that I had. You can use really anything just to hold it down. And let's scoop out all of our tea bags. Turn our heat off because we don't need it anymore. Alright, as you can see, what started as a white shirt is now a lovely tan. This is going to be more in line with a natural linen color or an unbleached cotton. Unbleached cotton would probably actually be a little bit lighter than this, but it's not the bright, stark white of a bleached cotton. If you want something a little bit darker, a darker color, you can by all means let it steep longer. You can let it steep overnight. If you do that to maintain the heat, I would recommend wrapping a couple towels around it just to insulate it. That'll make sure that it cools down slowly so that the dye bath stays hot longer. Heat is an important part of the dyeing process. I like this color, so we're going to move on to the next step. You can get rid of your tea bath at this point, or if you want to dye another piece of fabric, hang on to it, repeat the process for as many pieces as you have. Let's give this a quick wring out so that we're not dripping hot tea everywhere. Turns out it's not as hot as I thought it would be, but still, be careful. So I'm going to set this aside for a second. I'm going to empty out my tea, but I'm going to refill with cold water because next it needs to do a cold bath with the vinegar. Before the cold water bath though, first we're going to rinse this just enough to get the water running clear. It shouldn't take very long. Alright, we did a quick cold water rinse. You can see color is, kind of light, a little bit mottled, and that's just going to naturally happen with it, being all bunched up in the pot. That's why it's important to, as you check on it, stir it around a little bit, make sure the tea is getting in everywhere. So next, we're going to take our vinegar, and we are going to add 1/4 cup to a 1/2 cup of white vinegar to our cold water. I'm going to go with a 1/2 cup because I've got a pretty full pot of water here. And again, loosen this out. You don't want it bunched too tightly. Get it in there. Get it submerged. Squeeze out all of the air. Keep it underwater. We'll use my weights again to hold things down. And now we let it sit for 1 more hour. Alright, we are done with our vinegar water soak, so let's see what we have. Our fabric is a little bit lighter in color now. So let's wring this out. So our color is still slightly mottled, and that's just part of the natural dyeing process. The way it gets bunched in the pot, color will accumulate in certain areas more than others. So unless you have a nice big pot to allow this to really float around, you're going to get a little bit of mottling. But overall, it doesn't look too bad. We have a pretty good natural fiber color here. So all that's left now is just to dry it. You can either wring it out and let it air dry, or just throw it straight in the dryer. You can use medium heat, high heat, doesn't really matter. So let's throw this in and see what we have. It's the next morning. I put this in the dryer to go overnight, and now it is nice and dry and soft. As you can tell now, the color has become significantly lighter since it was wet. Before it was almost brown. Now it's a very soft beige. There are a few spots where the dye accentuated some existing staining that we couldn't see while the fabric was still white, including some lovely armpit stains. This isn't a deal breaker. There's still a lot you can do with this shirt, but this does remind us, buyer beware when buying garments from the thrift store, especially if you're going to dye them, that there may be some existing issues on the fabric that will change your dye. Overall, this was pretty successful. I'm pretty happy with this. I'm going to play with this a bit more and add some embellishments to it. I think I'm going to take off the collar and the hems, dirty it up a little bit, add some lacing down the front, and we'll see if we can't come up with something a little more piratey that's not just a beige t-shirt. After this, We'll take a quick break, and we're going to use some commercial dyes to get some bright blues and greens onto some white tablecloths that we have to continue the colored aesthetic that we have on our fabric fence panels.
Did you know that?
The earliest dyed flax fibers have been found in a prehistoric cave that dates back to 34,000 BC.
Now you know!
And we're back for part 2 of fabric dyeing. In this section, we're going to go over retail dyes specifically for synthetic fabrics. So we are starting with this stack of white tablecloths. I got these for dirt cheap off of a local bridal group on Facebook. Found someone who was selling them for, I think, $50 for 14. And these are 5 foot by 8 foot tablecloths. They're real big. They're great. We've been using them around site already, and so far they're holding up great. But white is not one of our camp colors, so we are going to try and dye them up to match some of our existing blue and green panels to keep our color scheme going. The first thing you need to do with this is find out how much fabric you have. For the brand of dye I'm using, its ratio is dependent on the weight of fabric. So if you have a kitchen scale, take one of your tablecloths, weigh it up. I weighed mine earlier and found that each cloth is about 1 pound, just slightly over. So that's something we're going to keep in mind as we go forward and prepare our dye bath according to the manufacturer's instructions. Next step, just like with the t-shirt, is to wash these. You want to wash them on hot to shrink them down if any shrinkage is going to happen. And you want to do your best to get rid of any staining before you dye it, because as we saw with the t-shirt, any existing stains that are not quite visible on the original color will show up very clearly once color is applied. So I'm going to run these down to the laundry and get them going, and we'll come back after that. Now that our fabric is in the wash, let's talk about the dye. I am using Rit brand Dye More liquid specifically for synthetic fabrics. Like we talked about in the last video, if you're using natural fabrics, you can use different kind of dyes, but if you're using synthetics, you have to use a dye that's specifically formulated for those synthetic fabrics. The color I'm going with today is the appropriately named Peacock Green. Again, we're going to try and match the colors to some existing tablecloths that we dyed a couple years ago. And I'm pretty sure this is the color we used back then. Read the directions. Following the directions is very key, because each dye has its own different method that works the best for it. In this one in particular, you have to use the stovetop method to maintain the high heat that this dye requires to fully set. Other brands, you can do the washing machine method, which is basically you fill up your washing machine with hot water and you do the dyeing in there. Your dye brand will have instructions for how to do that, but any dye that can use the washing machine method can also just as easily use the stovetop method. Personally, I prefer the stovetop method because I can keep an eye on it, and I am nervous about dyeing the inside of my washing machine. So we're going to stick to the stovetop. Just like before, the size of your pot matters. If you're only doing one bed sheet or one tablecloth, a pot about this size will work just fine. This specifically is a canning pot, but again, following the rule from the first part of the video, you need to make sure that you have enough liquid for your fabric to move about freely. And again, your dye will tell you how much water it needs per weight or volume of fabric. But if you have a lot of fabric like I do, you can use this big old monster. This is a 52 quart stock pot that Morgan is letting me borrow for this purpose. You don't need this if you're only doing a little bit of fabric, but like I said, I have 14 sheets to go through, so I'm going to try and speed up the process with this. If you're using a large pot like this, but you only have a standard range like that, what you can do, you use both burners, front and back, at the same time, and you have your pot straddling between them so that you have heat coming from two sources. For this dye in particular, it recommends keeping your water at 200 degrees Fahrenheit or above for best results. So, using this big pot, I'm going to use 2 burners. We're going to follow a lot of the same rules as, again, with the natural dye on the t-shirt. You want your fabric to still be damp before it goes in. And point of note for earlier, when you're weighing your fabric, make sure that you're weighing it dry. So with our fabric in the wash, we're going to let that go, and once it's ready to come on out, we'll get the dye bath going. Alright, I have 6 gallons of water going because I am going to do a double batch. Now, unsurprisingly, it takes a little while for 6 gallons of water to come up to a boil, which is about what we're looking for at 200 degrees. It's just shy of a boil. So a good way to speed up the process, you can do what I'm doing here and boil just a little bit at a time. You can see we're just over 200 now and we've got a gentle boil going. So that's about what we want in the big pot. You can also use a tea kettle if you have that, or even heat up water in the microwave, whatever it takes to get your water going. So I'm going to add this water to my big pot and double check my temperature. Last time I checked, we were at about 195 degrees, so we are almost there. Another way to get your water going hot faster is if your pot has a lid, use that. That'll keep the hot air in and it'll help raise the temperature of the water instead of escaping as steam. When you lift your lid off, be careful of the steam. It is going to be very hot, and also watch out for the water that is gathered on the underside of the lid so that you're not splashing yourself with hot water. We are now just at 200 degrees, so now I'm going to follow the directions of my dye to get the dye bath ready. This particular formula calls for 1/2 bottle to 3 gallons of water for each 1 pound of fabric. So I'm going to do a double batch so I can get 2 of my tablecloths going at the same time, try and speed things up a little bit. So, shake up the dye, and pour it all in. See if we can get some lovely green action there. And you want to make sure that you're using a pot that will not take up stain. This one recommends stainless steel, which is what we are using. This dye also calls for a teaspoon of liquid dish detergent. It doesn't specify if you should use dishwasher soap or hand soap. It just says liquid dish detergent. So I'm going to use my hand washing soap. Since it doesn't call for any other additive, it seems likely that the dish soap is acting as the mordant for this dye bath. So I have a probe thermometer, very basic stick-in one. You don't need a fancy electric one to check the temperature of your water. But again, if you don't have a thermometer, you want to keep things to a nice slow boil. You don't want to get it too agitated or else you risk burning your fabric on the bottom of the pan. I also have a nice big metal spoon to stir with. You can use a metal spoon, you can use tongs, but you need to be able to stir your fabric regularly to keep it moving and make sure that the dye gets into everything. And finally, our nice white fabric. So this is fresh from the wash, still a little bit damp. Like when we did our tea dyeing, you want your fabric to go in damp into the dye bath. So I'm going to stir up my dye bath, make sure everything is mixed in so that I get a consistent color. And let's get this tucked in. So here is our fabric just into the dye. Watch out for that steam. So you can see it just went in and it's already starting to take up the color. The directions on this dye call for consistent stirring for at least half an hour, no more than 1 hour. Oh, sorry about that steam. There we go. So I'm going to futz with this for 15 minutes and then I'll check the color. Again, like with the tea dyeing, it's going to come out very dark and then it's going to lighten after we rinse it and then lighten again after it's dried. So you want to make sure that whatever color you're going for, you let it get darker than that while it's still in the tea bath, and it will lighten up to your desired color. So we're going to check back in about 15 minutes. Alright, we just hit 15 minutes, and let's take a look at what we have. Our fabric has turned a rather pretty green, kind of a light apple green. I like the color, but I don't want to lose its vibrancy after I wash it. So I'm going to go for probably another 10 or 15 minutes, see if I can't darken the color a little bit, and then we'll get into rinsing. Alright, it has been a half hour and color hasn't changed too much. I think that's about as saturated as I'm going to get. So now I'm going to take this over to my sink to rinse it. According to the directions of the dye, I'm going to rinse it in warm water and then cool water until all the loose dye has come free. And then I am going to wash it in my washing machine or in warm water, and we'll see how it looks. So I did an experiment, I'm cheap and lazy and wanted to try and get a couple dye batches out of one dye bath. Turns out that doesn't work so well. This is after a half hour in the second batch, which is the same amount of time that gave us that beautiful rich green in the first batch. And as you can see, it is green, but very pale. So I'm not sure what I'm going to get out of this after it's rinsed and washed. By contrast, this is the first batch. Notice the lovely rich green. And the second batch. Very, very pale, kind of a mint green. So I'm going to run this through the rinse and then throw them all through the wash and let's see what happens. Alright, we are one wash later and here you can see the different results of the dyeing process. So here on the left, that's the pure white that we started with. Here in the middle, that's our first bath when the dye was fresh. And on the right is our second batch using the same dye bath. You can see the big difference between batch 1 and batch 2 using the same dye bath. So if you don't care about getting a consistent color across multiple batches, then go ahead, use the same dye bath. Just be aware that you're going to get a much lighter result in the second bath. Now I understand fabric dye can be a little expensive. The bottles that I bought retail at Joann's for $6 a bottle. So yes, that can add up pretty quick if you're trying to do this on a budget. If you are okay having a little bit lighter result, what I might recommend is instead of doing the 2 tablecloths per 6 gallons of water, I might add 3 and then maybe top off the water a little bit just to make sure that there's room to move all the fabric around. You'll get a lighter color, but you'll be able to stretch your dye a little bit further. I imagine it'll come out somewhat closer to the middle color, but it could edge, maybe halfway between the 2 shades. It's up to you. Experiment. See what you want to do. Worst case, you can always re-dye it. I am probably going to re-dye this second batch in a fresh dye bath. But that's it for part 2 of fabric dyeing using retail chemical dyes. I hope this video was informative. I hope it encourages you to go out and try to do some fabric dyeing of your own. And if you do, post the results. I'd love to see them, and we can show them off so that everyone else can see how easy it is also. Until next month, this is Magistrate Shae. See you later.